Game over, man. Game over.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
So serious.
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Welcome to this podcast review for June 3rd, 2025, and I'm Jada Duran.
And I'm Brendan Cassidy.
Hey, thanks for joining us, everybody, for this conversation. And look, as we get into this in the spirit of transparency, a couple of things here up front. One, we're going to have some thoughts on this film. We are, of course, talking about the new horror film, Bring Her Back. And as we are recording this, Twitter is currently on fire with a whole bunch of, you guessed it, nonsensical discourse.
When is it not on fire?
I know. This time surrounding the idea of YouTubers becoming filmmakers.
Well,
And I don't really care to have that conversation, especially here, because we're simply here to talk about this movie and review this film.
God forbid if you and I decide to direct a movie someday.
I know. I will say this. I will simply say this. I don't have any issue with anyone's journey or how they become an artist. Everyone has their story. They begin somewhere. Some begin with YouTube. Our beloved Koganada began on YouTube, or at least at some point found his way over to YouTube, and now he's one of my very favorite filmmakers working right now.
Yeah. I don't care where someone comes from. I'm with you.
Yeah.
I don't, as long as whatever they end up doing, and if we're there to talk about it and we're here to review it, I just want it to be good. I don't care how it gets good. I just want it to be good.
I just want it to be good. And that leads me to my second point. Again, in the spirit of transparency, if you follow Brendan and I on social media, if you follow us on Letterboxd, you already know how we feel about this. So I'm just going to let the cat out of the bag. We are not the biggest fans of this film. And I don't want to put words in Brendan's mouth, but based off of his comments just a moment ago, I presume that he agrees with me here. My issues with this film have nothing to do with them being YouTubers.
Shocker.
Shocker.
Look at that,
to do
folks.
with that.
We actually have nuance on this show.
I know. Has absolutely nothing
Nuance.
to do
Such a magic
with
word.
them being
Something
YouTubers.
Something that this movie needed more of.
Yeah. I think, especially based off of Talk to Me, the Philippou's previous movie, I do think they have potential. I think they can be good filmmakers.
I'm glad you bring that up because they're only 2 films in. I'm not ready to write them off just yet.
Yeah. I'm not ready either. For reasons we'll talk about, this one certainly did not register with us. Also, I am willing to concede here a little bit as well, because this is a film, and I, again, maybe presumptuously assume here that the nucleus of this discourse is stemmed from people that are criticizing the film quite heavily.
Yeah.
But a lot of people are responding to this positively.
Yeah, this is rocking what? Maybe a 75% on Metacritic. So it actually has what they deem as generally favorable reviews. So we have a lot of friends in this field that are responding very positively to this film and are finding it very effective.
Yeah.
And I wish I had that experience. I really wish I can relate to them when it comes to this one.
I agree. And look, I didn't look through every review on Letterboxd, but I think it's fair to say that there are much more positive reviews of that film on Letterboxd than there are negative reviews. So Brendan and I might be outliers here. To what degree, I don't know, because those against the film are being extremely loud at the moment.
Pretty vocal. Yeah, I don't know if we'll be that vocal. I mean, I will admit, I did give this movie a 1 out of 5 on Letterboxd, which makes it seem like I should be very hateful and vocal, but I don't like doing that unless I feel like it's warranted. This is not The Monkey from earlier this year, which actively pissed me off.
Yeah.
I didn't have that kind of experience where I did get vocal. But I am very disappointed that I didn't have the same experience with this one that a lot of other people seem to be having, because I like the intent of this one. I like what it's going for at the very least.
Yeah, this is a film, and I'm just looking at Letterboxd here, but it has an average rating of 3.8, and it has that big, massive spike because most films on there have a consensus spike at that 4-star mark. Some people have gone the full 5. There's plenty of 4.5. There's equally an amount of 3 and 3.5, but a lot of 4-star reviews for Bring Her Back on Letterboxd.
Yeah.
And you couple that with, to your point, Brendan, a 75 on Metacritic, which is good. It is good. So most people are responding to this positively, which is to say, to reiterate, I do recognize that Brendan and I might be in a little bit of a minority here, but, and I wanted to say all of this to say, we're going to do our best to have a nuanced, cordial conversation here. We're not going to go all in on, oh my God, these are YouTubers, they should step away from filmmaking. It is not that. That's not the conversation we're having anyway. Even though I think there is plenty to criticize here. There is a reason Brendan has this as a 1-star on Letterboxd, and I'm not too much higher. I think there is plenty to harp on here, and I think there's valid reasons for that. And equally, clearly, there are reasons for people liking this film and responding to it, clearly. Because, again, a lot of you seem to have liked this film too.
It's going for something. I'll simply say that.
Yes. Okay. I just wanted to get that off my chest before we get going here, because good gracious, the discourse around this film today has been
probably had
a nightmare.
Probably had at least half of our listeners just stop listening or watching right now.
Which is fine. Look, if you would rather just
okay
step away.
Yeah, that's
I
fine.
get it.
That's fine. Yeah.
Totally get it. I
Then
do
this-
understand.
The remaining bits of this episode will just be for myself and JD. It'll be a conversation.
Maybe
for
that's
us.
all this is.
Yeah.
I don't know. But if you are still with us and you liked this film, maybe even loved this film, I just want to emphasize, because I'm sure you're equally frustrated by the discourse on social media if you are
do
there
like
and
this
you
film,
saw
yeah.
that like that's not the conversation we're going to engage in.
We
here.
can have it both ways, right? We're frustrated by the discourse, and yet we didn't like this movie. I feel like there's very rare of that type of conversation happening.
Yeah, exactly. But let's talk about it. Bring Her Back. Supernatural horror film. Again, from Danny and Michael Philippou. This film stars Billy Barrett, Sora Wong, Sally Hawkins, Jono Ren Phillips, and a few others that come and go throughout the film. If you're not familiar with Bring Her Back, I imagine most of you, especially after that opening, most of you have seen this film or know what it's about. But just in case, a brother and sister uncover a terrifying ritual at the secluded home of their new foster mother, that foster mother, Laura, played by the great Sally Hawkins. That's what we're getting into here. And that brother and sister being Andy and Piper, played by Barrett and Wong, respectively.
Yeah,
They are
half siblings, if I'm not mistaken.
Half siblings. Yeah. Okay. With all of that laid out, Brendan, what did you think about Bring Her Back?
Well, I gave it a 1 out of 5 on Letterboxd, so I think that should be an indicator as to what I thought about it. I do want to bring up Talk to Me first, the Philippou's first movie leading into this one, which is a film that you and I didn't quite go for, but we at least recognized that there was a style to that movie that felt kind of unique, at least compared to the influx of horror movies nowadays. I think what I like the most about Talk to Me, I actually do like the first half of that movie. If anything, I think it's the back half where it really starts to lose its way and become too focused on trying to bring logic to the table, but also maintaining ambiguity. And it just doesn't have it both ways at all. But at least with that first half, one of the things I liked about it was taking this central theme in many horror movies nowadays of grief, but actually having a bit of fun with it. And I kind of like that. I like when they were having a bit of fun with it. And if you listen to the Philippou brothers in interviews, they are a very energetic, charismatic, and funny group of people. And I like when they bring that energy to this type of material. And Bring Her Back amplifies that energy to such a degree, but it's also taking itself so seriously that it just made for an experience that I found kind of bland and banal, if I'm being honest. I don't really like the criticism nowadays from some people that A24 trauma horror is all the same. I don't really buy into that criticism, but I do have a hard time, I guess, like pushing back on that criticism when it comes to something like Bring Her Back, because this is the first time I felt like A24 was simply just capitalizing on a brand as opposed to letting their filmmakers make a genuinely creative movie. And that's really my biggest issue with this. I jokingly, maybe cynically, tweeted that it seems like this is A24 horror by the way of ChatGPT, essentially. That's kind of what this feels like to me. And that might be a hyperbolic way of saying I think this movie is really not nearly as stylish or as innovative as I feel like some people are making it out to be. If anything, it really goes for the graphic nature of this story. The movie's more gross than anything else. The problem is that I don't feel like that grotesqueness is really supporting anything of merit. There is an underbelly of grief here, as we would expect, but I don't really think it's saying much outside of just the superficial notion. We've certainly seen other horror movies these days tap into this idea much more effectively. And I just don't think this one works. And I think it's trying to go for that. I think this is a movie, when compared to Talk to Me, this one is trying to take itself a little bit more seriously. And I think that's where it collapses on itself. I really don't think the Philippous are well equipped to tackle this type of heaviness in a serious way. And maybe they will sometime down the line. Maybe they'll find that niche and really hone in on it. But I'm not seeing that yet. And I don't think this capitalizes on their skills at all. I just did not find it effective. We're going to be talking about another movie this week, another review coming out this week that's actually a comedy, and I found that movie more of a successful horror movie than this one was, if I'm being honest. So this just did not work for me. It really felt like an A24 producer trying to capitalize on a brand, and I found that kind of bland.
Yeah, I am completely with you. I wasn't the biggest fan of this movie. I think there is some competent filmmaking here. I did like the craftsmanship at times, but all of that is undermined by feckless storytelling and a hollow thematic core. I found the experience here pretty empty. It's not entertaining. I didn't find it moving, which is saying a lot given who I am. And my ethos.
I know, yeah, you're the litmus test for these types of movies.
I know.
The central conflict here involving Sally Hawkins. If you're not moved by it, then I don't think the movie's doing its job.
It's not working. It's not working. And again, not only was I not moved, I didn't find it all that scary. And again, longtime listeners of the show,
yeah, you're the scaredy
might
cat.
find that comment equally provocative.
Added criteria to that litmus test.
Exactly. So I wasn't scared, which shocking statement on its own, and I wasn't moved emotionally either, which is equally mystifying. It does feel like the Philippou brothers traded in the energy and inventiveness of Talk to Me for something that is certainly more grim, to your point, but it's vapid and tedious. We get this punishing mix of bleak, grisly imagery stacked upon itself, scene over scene, without much purpose or payoff. It mistakes violence for mood and vague trauma for emotional depth. It wants to be about grief. It is aiming for something, again, to your point, but it never earns the weight that it's chasing. With Talk to Me, they obviously had this flashy, clever gimmick that helped mask some of the flaws that you get at the end of the film. And here, without that gimmick, it feels like the film, the acumen in terms of the drama and the themes of the film, those blemishes really come to the surface in a pretty brazen way. I do love Sally Hawkins here. God bless her. She is giving a
Yeah. She's
committed
trying.
guttural performance. I do
Trying.
think she's really great, but the script and the material around her does not do her any favors.
It doesn't
This
give her room to take advantage of that character and that emotional core
Yes,
even further.
exactly. The obsession, how grief has manifested for her, it is underwritten, it is underwhelming when it all crystallizes in the end, despite some effective imagery in a vacuum, such as the final shot of this film. I do want to talk about that
Okay.
here in a moment. There are moments individually that I do really like in terms of the building blocks of this film. I think of that moment with Laura smelling her daughter's sweater, or that moment where she's talking with Andy after they've had this night of drinking. There are moments that could have been extremely poignant, but the
Mhm.
film is more interested in that grisly imagery and the psychological torment than it is exploring what drives the madness that Laura demonstrates throughout this film.
Yeah.
And that is a problem. On paper, I think this could have been a compelling meditation on trauma and grief and loss, but in execution, it borders on exploitative, especially in how it handles themes of child abuse and neglect. And again, I find the film
Yeah.
extremely vapid. It throws so much at the wall, but it is so concerned with its horror tropes and plotting that it forgets that these are characters that are driven by uh, some sort of deep emotional mechanism.
Yeah.
And the film just it actively refuses to explore what that means.
Yeah.
And so everything is just on the surface, and
Yeah.
it did not work for me.
That's why I keep going back to that word empty. And I think you use that word as well in your opening
Yeah.
thoughts. And I
Yeah.
don't like using that word because I don't really think any movie is about nothing. To call a movie empty is to say that a movie isn't really about anything. Technically speaking, Bring Her Back does have themes, it has ideas. We just don't like the way it explores them or how deep that it goes. And I feel like this movie thinks it's deeper than it actually is. But
Mm-hmm.
everything there really is surface level. There are two good scenes in this movie, and you did highlight one of them, and that's the that back-to-back sequence between Laura and Andy after a night of drinking and they have
Yeah.
this conversation. It's not a horror scene specifically, but it is a good scene nonetheless. It's the moment where I feel like the movie is addressing some of those themes in a way that feels like it's trying to take it further. Again, the
Yes.
rest of the movie doesn't, follow up on that promise, but there's at least an attempt at something grounded, which I think this movie is ultimately
Exactly.
going for. The
And
other
letting
scene
the performances do some work for once.
yeah, I agree. The other scene that I think works, and it is perhaps the only scene in the movie that I feel like does the best job kind of fusing the horror and the drama together successfully. It's when Laura and Piper are kind of left alone in the house, and then she finally takes her to the shed and it reveals what's in that icebox, I'll
Oh
simply
yeah.
say.
Yeah.
That's an effective scene. And that's perhaps the scariest scene in the movie because it's actually rooted in something that feels very emotional, that feels
Yeah.
very honest.
Yeah.
But aside from that, the majority of the horror here is not much different than what you get out of a Saw movie. I really do think it's that superficial. If anything, this just feels like a more artfully made torture porn movie. like that's the extent of how visceral that this thing gets. And there were admittedly moments where I did find myself kind of, I don't want to say covering my eyes, but feeling tempted to. But that's because the movie's more
Mhm.
gross than it is frightening. It's a superficial masking of what's going on underneath, and
Yeah.
it felt more like a disguise. And I didn't like that. I didn't like that it was using it as more of a trick to hide the fact that this movie doesn't have much underneath the hood.
Mhm.
It's kind of hard to believe that this came from the same duo who made Talk to Me, which, again, a movie I didn't love. But that movie at least had a very clever premise and some clever symbolism around that
Mhm.
premise, kind of using this idea of talking to the dead as kind of a drug addiction. That's a really clever idea. And the
Mhm.
movie does do some interesting things with it. But this feels like not even a half realized version of that. It feels like an eighth realized version of that. It just feels so incomplete by comparison.
Yeah, I think that's very fair, where the two are quite comparable for me, because Talk to Me, while it is really interesting, especially the first half of that film, I do think similarly it stumbles in sticking the landing, especially on a thematic level. But
Agreed.
there is an emphasis on character and utilizing its clever gimmick in a way that at times it is quite compelling and visceral. Here with Bring Her Back, I do think there are elements of that same formula at play that, again, on paper, I am compelled by. The idea that Laura has this spiritual, supernatural formula that may give her a way to connect to the other side. But that lore is only shown to us. The one thing I do really appreciate about the film, and it's
that's true. That's true.
Like,
the world building
not
is
told
very
to
minimal
us.
here.
It's very minimal, and it's all done through visual storytelling. We just see
I
it
like
played out.
that
Like,
idea.
the white circles never explained to us. Do we see how it has an impact, like a physical impact on these characters? Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I do like that. And again, why I go back to the Philippous as filmmakers, there is promise there, because I do like that approach. A lot of horror films would just simply overly explain how all of this
You'll get the
works.
dreaded exposition dump where someone explains how everything works.
Don't get that here.
Yeah, we don't get that at all
here.
here. You're right.
And I do think that visual storytelling is done quite cogently, that it's easy to pick up on what's going on here, and you're able to connect all of the dots.
That's a good point.
The problem is the storytelling around these characters, and fully realizing, again, that emotional conflict that they're experiencing. A lot of it is simply built around the plotting of this film and getting us from A to B, instead of letting it waft over these characters. I think of that moment with Andy and him in the shower. He finally goes to take a shower. He had been quite timid to do this because of what he witnessed early on in the film. There's a reason he is nervous to take a shower. He goes to take a shower. Something happens. And again, what happens visually, I quite like, because again, it circles back to
that is one of the better
the
scenes in the
lore
movie.
of the film being not told to us. We just see it unfold, right?
Yeah.
So
it's tethered to the emotional core of the movie.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it begins in this interesting way, but what it amounts to in the end is nothing, because all that happens is that Andy has a moment. He freaks out. He falls, has to go to the hospital. And by him going to the hospital, it allows Laura to set her plan in motion. So instead of it becoming something that drives Andy further as a character, or driving the film's themes further, it just becomes a plot mechanism and nothing more.
Yeah. And that's less interesting to us.
And that's less interesting. That to me is ultimately where this film falters. And the same thing with Ali, and we can talk further about Ali as well. Like, there are interesting pockets here where it's like, okay, the film is starting to build, but then it becomes undermined when we start to realize that, this isn't about character. This isn't about theme. This is just getting us from A to B to C.
Yeah, it's using grief as a narrative crutch as opposed to a thematic crutch. And I'm with you.
It's just like, it just fundamentally, like Talk to Her, I think, like, I feel like it is there. I can understand why people are responding to this. Like, I feel like I can see it, but for me, all of that is on the surface, and the threads are too loose. Like, it never amounts to anything. There's nothing that crystallizes in the end.
it's easy to latch on to that stuff, right? Because it's right there in front of you. And that's maybe
Yeah.
why it's so easy to gravitate towards this movie, or at least maybe why some are gravitating towards this movie more positively than we are.
Mhm.
And, you know, at least with a film like Talk to Me, I can be a little more forgiving of that thematic superficiality because at least that movie was having a bit more fun. So, kind of playing with those
Yeah.
tropes of grief as a thematic device, but using it more as a narrative tool. That movie was meant to be more enjoyed than it was stimulating, I guess, if that makes sense. But I don't think that's the case with Bring Her Back. I think
Mhm.
it seems as though the Philippous are trying to challenge themselves a bit more and to make something that is a bit more earnest and a bit more heartfelt. This really does try to go for an emotional climax, and I don't think it gets there at all. I don't think it works,
Yeah.
even despite how great Sally Hawkins as an actress is. And I love the idea of her playing a role like this because we commonly associate her as quite literally this happy-go-lucky woman, and this is everything
Yeah.
not this is not that at all. This is anything but that.
Well, if
So
anything, the film is exploiting her happy-go-lucky performance and then
it's
recontextualizing it
oh
for
yeah,
the horror of this film.
it's very deconstructionistic in that way.
Yeah. Yeah.
And which I like that idea. But
Yeah.
again, everything that I'm going to say about this movie that's positive, kind of like you, is that I like the idea. I like the seeds. I like what it's going for. But I'm less forgiving of it here because this doesn't have the same whimsy as Talk to Me did. Like
Yeah.
I think if this movie were a bit goofier in a way, I think I could be more forgiving of some of those tricks that it's aiming for. But I don't think that's the case here, and that's more frustrating when I feel like it's asking us to dig deeper.
Well, and not just frustrating, but again, as I noted in my opening thoughts, I think it borderlines on being feckless because you're dealing with shock and gore and trauma around the death of children.
Yeah,
So
yeah. So
not, falling through on those ideas here becomes much more arduous and cumbersome from a storytelling perspective and by proxy in terms of us as the audience and our reception of it, which is why I am admittedly surprised by the overall positive reaction because
mhm.
its emptiness and how it fails to follow through, at least I would argue. Many
Yeah,
people
me
might
too.
disagree clearly, but I would argue that the film fails to follow through on that. And because of what you're saying, it becomes overbearing. And like to me, that's where when you're dealing with children in that way, and all this becomes is a mechanism for you to shock the audience by
Yeah,
placing
that's
children in these really horrific situations, and that's all it is. It doesn't become about the film's themes and
no.
manifesting grief in an interesting way.
It's a cheap tactic, is what it
It's
is.
extremely cheap.
Yeah, and
And I
that
think
yeah.
ultimately, sorry to keep
No, you're
going
good.
on
You're
here,
good. You're good.
but while we joked about it earlier about me not being moved, I think ultimately that's why, despite foundationally this being something that should have destroyed me,
Mhm.
it didn't, because I think seeping in was that frustration, and not just frustration, but borderline anger as
Well,
to like
yeah.
the storytelling here and how just how caustic I feel
It
like it is because it's
yeah.
placing children in these
It
really
it
horrible situations
it kind of feels as though, and
for no
again,
purpose, with
well,
no purpose. Sorry.
yeah, it kind of feels as though, and I don't want to speak for the Philippines. I'm just making a generalization and sort of a hypothesis. It feels as though they were making this movie and their goal was to make something that was a bit more emotionally challenging, something that were to move the audience. And they thought to themselves, what can we do to move them? Oh, let's put children in peril. That always works. Like that's kind of what it feels like.
Yeah.
And again, like I don't like seeing children in peril in the movies, and this takes it to a degree that I don't think I've ever
Mhm.
really seen. So there's a uniqueness there, I guess. That said, I'm not a
Gaspar Noé would have loved it.
oh,
He would
Gaspar,
have
no,
been
absolutely
proud.
would. Yeah, he would have been very proud. Maybe Lars von Trier as well.
Yeah.
And I also want to say, even though I don't like seeing that in movies, children in peril specifically, I'm not against movies doing it, especially if there is a point
Yeah.
to it. You know, like we've seen movies that are very hard to stomach that tackle these types of things, but we've
Yeah.
still been positive on the movie because it actually had something to say, and we didn't feel like it was just
Yeah.
a cheap scare tactic. But in this
Yeah.
case, it is just a cheap tactic, and that's where it just
Mhm.
feels, well, cheap. That's the best way I can put it.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't, and I do want to emphasize that's why I use the word purpose. At least
Yeah.
I tried to get that word out. I don't have an issue with it either. Putting
Yeah.
children in peril, that is something that happens in the real world all the time. Art reflecting that, I don't have an issue with it as long as there is purpose to it. You're not just doing it for gore's sake or for shock's sake. Do you remember the 2018 Russian film Loveless?
Oh,
Do you remember that
yeah.
one?
Yeah, that was a good movie. We liked that
That
one.
I loved that film. That movie is extremely bleak. It is
Yeah.
one of the darkest, one of the most bleak films I have ever seen.
Mhm.
So I can't
Oh, yeah.
recommend it.
That scene in the morgue,
Oh my God. It
I
is
will never forget
devastating.
that. I will never
It is,
forget that scene.
it is so devastating. But that is a film that puts a child in this horrible situation that we as the audience, we are devastated by. We empathize and feel for these characters that are searching for this child, but there is purpose to it. The film uses that to do something provocative and compelling and emotional, and it works in that movie. So I don't have an issue with movies putting children in these arduous circumstances. It's how the film goes about examining it, how the film goes
Yeah.
about doing that. That's where I draw the line, or where I, and like, where I question, the film and what it's trying to do. And here, again, fundamentally, ideally, sure, like you want to put these children in this circumstance, and you want to talk about grief and how ritualistic, these ritualistic things may or may not bring them back, and like all of that. I don't have an issue with the premise of the film. The premise is fine.
Neither do I.
It all comes down to execution, and I think because of how empty it ultimately ends up being, it not only does it not have anything to say, it just comes off as the sadistic exercise.
Well, and for more of a frame of reference here, just to give more context to this, another movie that does put at least a child in very serious and devastating peril is Talk to Me. And I actually didn't
Yeah.
mind that scene in that movie, that centerpiece involving, I think it was the character of Riley, played by Joe Bird, kind of the, if you want to call it the action centerpiece of that movie in a way. I think that's a fair way to describe it. But there's a scene where that young boy is completely beaten to hell, given the situation at hand.
Mm-hmm.
And while I don't know if the movie follows through any further on where that aftermath goes, I think in the moment, I was accepting of that scene because it was still fueled by a thematic centerpiece that made sense given all the characters at that point. Like that
Yeah.
made sense. So the Philippous have done this before, and I thought it kind of worked. So that's like I'm bringing that up to say that we know that they could do that. And in both of their movies, they're putting children in peril, but it's not apples to apples. It's not just that
Yeah.
thing. It's the context of how it's utilized, and we don't like how it's utilized here.
Yeah, that's ultimately what it comes down to. And so as a result, there are moments here, especially when we get toward the end, that are extremely frivolous, and they, again, just amount to nothing. But I feel like in the hands of another filmmaker, those images could be not just arresting in the context of this film and what it's trying to do, but some of the most memorable images of the year. I noted in my opening thoughts that final scene with Laura at the end, where we see her in the pool. I think on its own terms, if you separate that image away from the context of this film, it is one of those images that we should be talking about as, holy Lord, that is one of the most incredible horror shots we've seen of the last decade. It is quite an arresting image on its own. Laura, who she's with, I'll say vaguely, and how grief has manifested to such a degree that that's where we find her at the end. Unreal. Totally unreal.
And that's the one moment where Sally Hawkins as an actress is allowed to really breathe and push past the material and actually give us something.
Because it's not about her having to deal with some sort of ritualistic horror.
There's no plotting to
There's no plot. It's just about her grief at its most raw. And I think a lot of us can empathize with that. As crazy as that is, given what the image actually is, how grotesque that it is. But there's something about it that deeply resonates and makes sense to me. The problem is the image carries no weight with me because of how the film builds to it.
Yeah.
It is just so deeply frustrating. Like it's maybe a little shocking, but there's a shock to it. There's a grotesqueness to it that I want to love, that I deeply want to resonate with, and I just can't.
And
I just can't get there.
It just doesn't help that I feel like a lot of the movie is A24 horror on autopilot. I really do think that. And I hate saying that because I think these directors showed promise with Talk to Me, that they at least had a style. They at least had something that could be uniquely theirs. I admittedly felt kind of little of that here. It really does feel like it was an assembly line product for A24 to get another horror movie out there.
Yeah, which I do, again, I think is frustrating because there are elements here that are quite great. It's just so disjointed and all over the place without culminating into anything. Another aspect that I feel similar about is the Andy character. I don't know if we want to get into spoilers or not. Andy being this guilt-ridden teenager, I think there's great nuance with the character given this incident that happened to him when Piper was just 8 years old. You couple that with what we come to learn about how his own father treated him, and it makes sense that Andy is this struggling 17-year-old kid.
Yeah.
And then we see what happens to him at the end, and again, I just feel like
it's a bait and switch.
Nothing.
It's a bait and switch. Yeah. The movie teases us that he's the main character, and then all of a sudden he's not. I'll simply say, and and
what does it amount to? Like the way that character crystallizes, again, like the bait and switch of it aside, like we spend a lot of time with him in this film. Does it amount to anything?
Well, the problem is that, I mean, I don't necessarily mind that it doesn't amount to anything. At the same time, I do mind that it doesn't amount to anything. But we've seen movies before that introduce characters and their arcs conclude in some way before it has a chance to amount to anything. And at times that could actually be an asset to the movie, as if like the inconclusiveness of that character arc is the devastating aspect of it. But I don't think that's the case here, because I think so much of what Andy has to go through and what he has to navigate as a character, it's way too plot focused, and it doesn't give the character's motivations and what's fueling him a chance to breathe.
Well, and that's the thing. When a character's arc is cut short, to your point, that only works if we're compelled by the character and the film makes good use of that.
It's the Mahershala Ali thing from Moonlight.
Yes.
Right? Like that's a great example of how it works.
Exactly. And it's nothing against Barrett as a performer. And there are aspects to the character that I do really like, but I still think there's not enough time to let the emotional core of that character and the film. In some ways, I feel like the reason the bait and switch doesn't work for me is because it is almost the antithetical Moonlight example that you mentioned there a moment ago, because
Hmm.
we spend so much time with Andy. We learn more about him as the film goes. So it feels as if we're building to some sort of climax where he's going to, in some way, shape, or form, he's going to crystallize like his own grief, his relationship as it relates to Piper, whether he lives or dies. He
Yeah.
doesn't necessarily have to live in the end. He doesn't have to die in the end, as long as the film takes the progression of that character and then utilizes it in some fashion that makes sense for the story and for the character and the emotional progression of him throughout the film. And I
Hmm.
just feel like it flatlines. Like it doesn't build to anything.
I
It's
didn't find
just
myself
cut off.
missing the character or anything like that, and I feel like you kind of needed that effect. It when you cut a character short like that, if it leaves a lingering sting, that means the movie maybe handles it well. But here, I think it's just there to surprise you. I think that's really all it is.
Yeah. It's just there for shock's sake.
Yeah.
And like personally, again, I think it plays into the feckless storytelling here.
Yeah, we're just
I
not
found
interested in that.
I found it mostly vapid. I did not find it interesting at all.
Yeah, I will give all of these actors some credit for at least committing to the heaviness of this material. Billy
Mhm.
Barrett is effective as Andy. Sora Wong as Piper, I think, is also quite good in her scenes. Jonah Wren Phillips, who plays Oliver, or Ollie as he's called,
Yeah,
he is asked to do a lot, to
a
the
lot.
point
Yeah.
that he might be in therapy right now. That actor, there are things he is asked
And
to
he's
do,
like what, 12?
something like that. Yeah,
Goodness
I
gracious.
mean, the bulk of this movie's quote unquote horror, really the grotesqueness of this movie is really because of him. It's really because of Oliver. Much of it is due to him. He has to carry a lot of that.
Yeah, he's
So,
the unsung hero here.
well, I mean, he could have been if the material gave any weight to that grotesqueness, but it doesn't. So I feel like he's just doing it for the sake of doing it. But that's not his fault. That's the material's fault. That's the filmmaker's fault. But he's at least committed. He's certainly
Yeah.
trying his damnedest to do what the Philippos are asking of him. And I give him credit
Yeah.
there.
No, I mean, I agree. I think there's a version of the character that is extremely affecting. And I did really like the performance. I love the commitment to it. And those two scenes, there are two scenes in this film where we see Ollie, I'll say vaguely, get outside of himself a little bit.
Hmm.
And the way Phillips delivers that dialogue, it is gut wrenching. It is really,
Yeah,
really
I don't
good.
disagree. I don't disagree.
But again, like I don't think like the issues of the film are not on the performers. I don't think it's on Sally Hawkins. It's not on Billy Barrett, Sora Wong. It's certainly not on Phillips either. The problem is that we have all of these threads. There are at least 4 or 5 of them constantly working against each other, and so it just becomes about the plot and getting us from one point to the next instead of allowing these characters to really breathe or let that horror
Yeah.
just kind of simmer there in these incredible ways. When the film does that, it is effective. And there are examples that we've brought up here in this conversation, but ultimately it's too jumbled of a mess that
Yeah.
never really comes together for me. Like that to me, that's the biggest issue here.
I don't think I have any more to add. I'm with you, man. I'm with you.
Yeah, I think that's it as well. I
I
don't know if I have
I
anything else.
I am still willing to give the Philippines another chance because I know
Mhm.
they're talented filmmakers. We've at least seen enough evidence of that they do have a few creative swings up their sleeves. Most of those creative swings I feel like came from Talk to Me. Again, weirdly a film I still didn't really care for all that much, but I think the first half of that movie is quite good. And I'm not going to ask them to make a certain movie like they're listening to this podcast. They wouldn't care. They'll make whatever the hell they want to make. But if it were up to me, I would like to see them make something that is a bit fun. You know, maybe a horror comedy or something like that. I think
Mhm.
the evidence that I've seen thus far as to what makes their tactics the most effective, it is when they are having a little bit of more fun. And I kind of want to see them tap into that a little bit more once again.
Yeah, perhaps a tonal shift would be helpful.
Mhm.
The biggest issue I have with both of these films comes down to the overall storytelling. Connect your visuals to the narrative, to the characters, and the themes that you are exploring. Right now, it just feels like they have great ideas, a fascinating concept, and I do think they know how to use a camera. That to me is evident.
They need a script doctor.
They just need someone to help them, like stay focused. And maybe it's in the editing. I don't know. Maybe there's a way to re-edit these films to, help maintain that focus.
Maybe
I don't know.
I
Left on the cutting room floor, but
I still feel like it's mostly on the page. I really do. So, but again, that's a guess. We as critics can only go for by what we see and what we see.
Exactly. We don't know what is on the editing room floor.
Yeah.
For all we know, with Bring Her Back, there's another 45 minutes that is emphasizing character and theme and emotion that was cut out because, I don't know. We're trying to make an entertaining horror flick.
Watch them make a horror epic next that's like 3 hours long, and it be the best thing they've ever done.
Yeah. And that's why, like, again, maybe it's the editing, maybe it is the writing, could be a combination of the two. I don't know. I do think there's promise there. I just feel like with both movies, they got to take their ideas and formulate those threads to a single point at the end that makes sense of everything.
Yeah.
That's kind of where I'm at with the Philippous. But yeah. I'm willing to give them another shot for sure.
Me too. And I
hope
hope
against them.
Yeah. Hope to be proven wrong.
Yep. Okay. Well, with that said, if you agree or disagree with anything we had to say, and look, given the beginning of this whole episode, you may wholeheartedly disagree with us. That is fine. Leave a comment below if you're watching on YouTube. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, reach out to us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Blue Sky, TikTok. You can email us in sessionfilm@gmail.com, but we would love to hear from you. Be sure to subscribe to the show if you're watching us on YouTube. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, all that fun stuff. Subscribe if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Stay tuned. We are going to have another review this week as well. We're going to be talking about the horror comedy. I think we can call it fair.
I think that's fair. Even the trailers kind of market itself as that.
Yes, the film Friendship. We're going to talk about that one as well. So be on the lookout for that. Episode 639 is available. We talk about our top 5 performances of the decade so far. Obviously, we are halfway through the 2020s. It's crazy to think we are halfway through the 2020s.
Yeah, we survived the pandemic. That's insane.
Crazy. Over the next few weeks, we're going to be dedicating ourselves to that. We started with performances. Next week, we'll do something else, and then we will conclude with our best movies of the decade so far. And we have a really fun special guest planned for that as well. Okay, with all of that said, also stay tuned, Women in Session. There'll be a new episode of Women in Session on Friday as well. With all of that said, thanks for listening, everybody. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time on the In Session Film Podcast. Sally Hawkins is good. I think she's innocent.
Bring her back. We got to go back, Kate.